Story 1. A small-scale event. Napoleonic marshals Lannes and Murat risking their lives and bluffing their way to capture a bridge held by the Austrian army has always sounded to me like a movie plot. They were under orders to capture the bridge. The Austrians had orders to blow it up if they couldn't hold it. Seeing the explosives already in place, Lannes and Murat told their men to adopt a slow parade walk. They themselves rode up alone to the bemused Austrian army, joking and smoking. They thanked them for holding the bridge but said that now that the armistice was signed, they would be taking over. Lannes sat on the barrel of explosives and reminded the officers that their own emperor would be really displeased if they blew essential infrastructure for nothing. They might even restart the war. They were so convincing that the officer in charge sent someone to headquarters to confirm that an armistice had been signed. A sergeant saw right through the ruse and wanted to blow the bridge. "Do you allow your men to talk to their officers like that in the Austrian army?" asked Murat, and the sergeant was told to shut up. Meanwhile, the French army was slowly crossing the bridge, still in parade formation. There was, of course, no armistice signed, and the French captured the bridge as soon as they crossed it. The only thing missing are a few witty one-liners. Story 2. When they made his biographical film, didn't they leave out many of the incredible things Audie Murphy did because they were too unbelievable? Story 3. Colorado Coalfield War. The National Guard killed the wives and children of striking miners. Also, in the Battle of Blair Mountain a few years later, the United States Army dropped poison gas and bombs from planes onto striking miners. Story 4. It has been made into a movie, so it kind of does not count, but the story of Tetris is wild. The movie is inaccurate in places, by the way, but well worth a watch. Story 5. The Shackleton Endurance Expedition is remarkable. The boat was stranded on drifting ice for months, eventually crushed and sunk. The crew used 3 small, unprotected lifeboats to navigate to a small rocky barren outcrop in freezing winter during a gale. Then, a few of them took a boat and made a passage of hundreds of miles across the roughest sea on the planet to reach a small island on the wrong side. They had to cross an uncharted mountain range on foot, with no gear or food, to reach a whaling station and call for help. Every single crew member survived. Story 6. The molasses flood caused fatalities because of a wave of boiling molasses flowing down the streets. This sounds like the nightmare of a 5-year-old with a fever. Story 7. Battle of Castle Itter towards the end of World War II, where a few United States tanks, German soldiers, French prisoners including women, Austrian resistance members, and a Schutzstaffel defector totaling 36 people, joined together to defend themselves from 150 to 200 Schutzstaffel soldiers in one. Story 8. The man who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand failed twice and decided to get something to eat at a cafe. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand drove right in front of him, he pulled out his gun and took the shot. Story 9. You're not getting many accurate answers, so I'll give you a real one. The assassination of Kim Jong-un's older brother sounds like something out of a television show. They tricked 2 young women into thinking they were on a television prank show for about a year. They went around pranking people in different locations. The prank was that one girl would run up and rub hand sanitizer on someone's face and then giggle while running away. The other girl would run up and squirt perfume on their face, giggle, and run away. Funny prank, right? They were carefully taught exactly how and where to apply the products and to run away and wash their hands immediately. Little did these girls know they were training to kill Kim Jong-un's older brother. On the day of the actual murder, it was no longer hand sanitizer and perfume. It was 2 components of a deadly neurotoxin that, once combined, caused a rapid, painful death. They were pranking people and filming at the airport when Kim Jong-nam arrived with his family. The producers of the prank show had the girls target him. The first girl rubbed the first half of the poison on his face, giggled, and ran away. The second girl ran up and squirted him with perfume, but it was the other half of the neurotoxin, then giggled and ran away. He realized something was wrong immediately because of the pain and approached security, but he was dead within minutes. The girls were caught immediately due to extensive CCTV, but not the people directing the attack. They had no idea they had just killed someone. They thought they were going to be TV stars. It is widely believed that Kim Jong-un and his sister had Kim Jong-nam killed because he was an embarrassment to the family, as he favored Western pop culture. In fact, he was sneaking off to Disneyland when they attacked him. Story 10. I always thought the dancing plague was hilariously absurd. Don't get me wrong, I have been to the club, but you have to have something else going on if you are dropping unconscious in the middle of dancing. Story 11. Counterfeit soot. At a Discworld convention, Terry Pratchett talked about how he used real-world history as material, but he had a folder of things that were too absurd because even in an absurdist story, they would break people's suspension of disbelief. The example he gave was counterfeit soot. In Victorian London, soot was actually worth something. Not a lot, but a chimney sweep who was down on their luck might offer to sweep your chimney for free in exchange for the soot because it could be sold to tanners, dyers, and a few other uses. So people started counterfeiting soot. Story 12. Hannibal crossing the Alps, smashing 3 Roman armies in 3 years, including a perfect encirclement tactic that was influential in modern battle tactics, then not besieging or attacking Rome directly. Story 13. Assassination of Franz Ferdinand. 6 men prepare bombs to throw at his open-topped car. The first 2 back out. The third throws his bomb, but it bounces off the car and explodes without injuring Franz Ferdinand. The driver then takes a detour to avoid the remaining 3 assassins. After a formal event, the route of the cavalcade is changed, but they fail to inform Franz Ferdinand's driver, so he drives off in a different direction from everyone else. He gets lost, goes down a side street, tries to reverse, then stalls the car. This happens right outside the restaurant where Princip is having lunch, so he steps out and shoots Franz Ferdinand. Princip then runs off to the river to try to drown himself. However, there has been no rain and the water is only a few inches deep, so he fails. It appears that at least a couple of time travelers have already gone back to try to change these events. I suspect Franz Ferdinand, had he lived, would have become a murderous dictator, and the time travelers have, in our timeline at least, prevented that outcome. Story 14. There was a group of 38 soldiers tasked with guarding a mountain pass during World War I. No one ever came through except for one man who joined them. They spent the war enjoying a mountain vacation. I cannot remember the country, but it was a small European one. Story 15. The Israeli intelligence service caused pagers and radios to explode remotely, all at once. Story 16. I think if you went back in time and tried to pitch a presidency similar to Donald Trump's as a serious movie, the studios would laugh in your face. Story 17. Almost everything in the last 10 years would have been considered unbelievable if you went back in time before September 11, 2001. Story 18. Since it is Canada Day, Leo Major liberated an entire Dutch city from German occupation in one night by himself. Story 19. The Great Emu War. In Western Australia in the 1930s, the military was called in to eradicate a large emu population that was destroying wheat crops. They failed spectacularly and had to withdraw. Australia's military went to war with a flock of giant birds and was defeated. Story 20. World War I. All the alliances seem like a series of contrivances put in place to lead to the start of a war. The actual trigger, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, was marked by a series of remarkable incompetencies and coincidences. Amid it all, one of the longest-lasting and largest empires, Russia, collapsed. A global war not enough? Then a pandemic followed, possibly responsible for 50 million deaths in just 2 years. The conflict ended in an unsatisfying and inconclusive way, clearly leaving an opening for a sequel. Story 21. It has happened. There are a few one-liners in the film 300 that people laughed off but are historically accurate. Spartans, lay down your weapons. Persians, come and get them. And our arrows will block out the sun. Then we shall fight in the shade. Story 22. A Union scavenger captured a Nazi-held city by himself during World War II. There are many of these remarkable stories. A more well-known story is the Christmas truce between Allied soldiers and enemy forces during World War I. I heard from a teacher once that Adolf Hitler was involved in that event. The case of Fred Hampton and the Federal Bureau of Investigation Counterintelligence Program files is another example. Lastly, the gay test experiment aimed to identify homosexual military members. Story 23. Jack Churchill, also known as Mad Jack, was a British Army officer renowned for his eccentricity and bravery during World War II. He was famous for carrying a longbow, bagpipes, and a Scottish broadsword into battle. Churchill participated in several significant operations, including the invasion of Normandy and campaigns in Burma. His unconventional tactics and fearless leadership made him a legendary figure in military history. Story 24. Lavrenti Beria. In the film The Death of Stalin, they downplayed how evil he was because they thought the audience would not believe it. Story 25. The real things Audie Murphy did in World War II. When they made his movie, that was the exact reason they cut a lot. No one would have believed it. Story 26. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima for work when the atomic bomb dropped. He survived and returned home to Nagasaki, where he also survived the second atomic bomb. Story 27. Captain Viktor Leonov is credited with capturing and disarming 200 officers and 3,500 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, in addition to capturing 3 artillery batteries, 5 aircraft, and several ammunition depots, without suffering a single casualty. Story 28. Battle of Castle Itter. Some German soldiers teamed up with U.S. soldiers and a tank to assault a castle held by Schutzstaffel soldiers to free the hostages. Among those hostages was a famous tennis player. Story 29. Caesar was kidnapped by pirates and resented that the ransom asked for was too small. In 75 BCE, the future dictator of Rome was kidnapped. He insisted that the pirates raise the ransom. After his release, he organized a fleet, captured them, and crucified them. Story 30. It is very recent. The Israeli Mossad operation in Iran at the beginning of the month involved building an entire drone base inside Iran and attacking numerous high-profile military and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps members, along with their entire air defense system all at once. This event surpasses what is seen in movies. Story 31. A man incited 1,500 people to attack the Capitol, killing a guard and injuring several others, was re-elected president, and then pardoned the assailants. Story 32. Subutai and his 20,000 scouting reconnaissance force crushed multiple numerically superior armies and altered the history of several nations forever. Story 33. I'm going to talk about the entire French Revolution. When you examine it and go through the cascade of events that resulted in this huge, society-shaking conflict, it's remarkable. There are many points where it seems that if something had gone differently or a different decision had been made, it might not have spiraled out of control. But inevitably, almost the worst possible decision or action was taken. A comedy of errors with a truly tragic outcome. Story 34. Henry VIII in England changed the entire religion of his country so he could marry Anne Boleyn, among many other things that no dramatist would dare to make up. Story 35. The fact that the East India Company India had a war of independence because of a gun cartridge lubricated with pig and cow fat. Story 36. A biopic on Carlos Hathcock III. Born a rural farmer hunting to survive, he restarted the Marine Corps sniper program, held off entire platoons with just himself and a spotter, and experienced many other remarkable stories. Story 37. The story of Desmond Doss at Hacksaw Ridge is literally so unbelievable that the movie made about it did not even tell everything out of fear that it would be too unbelievable for viewers. Story 38. After landing in Taranto to start his Italian campaign, Special Air Service Major Oswald Carielwis came into contact with an escapee from a concentration camp in Pistici. Although 60 miles behind enemy lines, the prisoners were about to be moved to Germany and would likely meet their death. Upon hearing this, Carielwis decided to steal a steam locomotive to assault the camp, breaking out over 180 prisoners. The action was so successful that they even managed to take the camp commandant with them. Story 39. The number of medals Georgy Zhukov wore in the film Death of Stalin was reduced because Jason Isaacs and the director thought the actual number would not be believed by the audience. Story 40. Fairly recent and not historical, but the New England Patriots beating the Atlanta Falcons in the Super Bowl would have been described as impossible if it had been a film. Story 41. Basically every episode of Special Air Service, Rogue Heroes. The number of times I had to pause thinking, wait, there is no way this actually happened, only to search and find that it did. Story 42. The Indiana Pacers playoff run this year featured many clutch shots in multiple games. Such a postseason performance would not be accepted for a first draft for being unbelievable. They had plot armor. Story 43. The Bone Wars involved two paleontologists in the 1870s who became so competitive that they started destroying fossil sites to spite each other. Story 44. Operation Cottage. The United States and Canada lost over 100 men dead and over 300 wounded, and had a destroyer sustain heavy damage while taking an island from an enemy who was not even there. The Japanese had pulled out 2 weeks earlier. This was probably the most embarrassing failure during World War II. Story 45. William Goldman wrote about this in his book Adventures in the Screen Trade. He gave the example of Michael Fagan climbing up a Buckingham Palace drainpipe one night in 1982, entering the palace, walking to the Queen's bedroom while she was there, and sitting on her bed. There were many other bizarre elements to this already unusual story that Goldman said nobody would ever believe any movie based on the incident. Goldman also mentioned that the casting of Ryan O'Neal as Brigadier General James Gavin in A Bridge Too Far was problematic because O'Neal was thought to be too young to be believable in the role, even though he was older than the real James Gavin was at the time of the events depicted in the movie. Story 46. The events described in the Star-Spangled Banner involve the British being defeated on land and then attempting to attack Baltimore from a different side by sea. However, a fort blocked their path. The British, not particularly concerned about Baltimore, tried to destroy the fort for 27 hours using long-range weapons rather than risking a direct naval attack. They used two types of weapons: Congreve rockets, developed by Sir William Congreve, whose father was the British government's weapon supplier. The rockets were unsuccessful, lacking the range to hit the fort accurately. They were essentially fireworks at that distance, filling the sky with red bursts of flame. The other weapon was a bomb mortar, a large explosive shell launched from massive mortars. These were unreliable, often missing their targets, and the fuses, designed to prevent detonation during firing, frequently failed. One bomb landed on the fort's powder magazine, but the fuse did not ignite, preventing an explosion. Despite nearly 2,000 projectiles being fired at the fort, very few soldiers were killed. The next morning, the fort continued its daily operations unhindered. It was a peculiar battle, with the British trying an unproven strategy, lacking the motivation to win and unwilling to risk heavy losses. The Americans succeeded by simply holding their position. This strange battle inspired the American national anthem, thanks to a congressman from Baltimore who promoted it. The melody of the national anthem is British. Story 47. In the 19th century, a Chinese prostitute, today known as Zheng Yisao, married a pirate. She helped her husband consolidate control of a large confederation of pirate ships. After her husband died, she married her adoptive son, further consolidated power, and led the largest pirate force in human history. Over 40,000 pirates and 400 vessels, terrorizing the Pearl River Delta, where Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Macau are located. The Chinese Navy was overwhelmed and requested aid from the British and Portuguese. Zheng Yisao continued the fight but realized that, over time, they were going to lose. She negotiated a surrender and secured amnesty for herself and her crew. She quietly lived out the rest of her life running a gambling house. Story 48. In the American Civil War, the pivotal battle, the Battle of Antietam, may never have happened except for a careless officer and some cigars. General Robert E. Lee wrote an order detailing the planned movements of the Confederate Army during Lee's Maryland campaign. One particular set of orders was wrapped with a bundle of cigars for safekeeping. That bundle of cigars was lost, and later a Union soldier, while walking through the field where they were misplaced, saw the cigars and said, "Hey, free cigars!" He found a note wrapped with them and showed it to his commanding officer, who passed it up the chain of command, allowing the Union Army to know exactly where to go to catch the Confederates. If this were in a movie, people would complain about it being an unrealistic plot device. Story 49. Boudica. After her partner, the king, died, the plan to take over was ignored by other rulers. She was flogged, and her 2 daughters were assaulted. Angry at the injustice, she marched from town to town and gathered an army. Although she ultimately lost, she managed to burn down parts of London and St. Albans. With her growing army moving through towns, inviting people to join her cause, they managed to kill around 70,000 enemies. Her story is amazing and deserves a proper, high-quality movie rather than the low-budget versions currently available. Story 50. An Australian doctor named Barry Marshall was conducting research in the 1980s to show that bacteria, not stress, was the cause of stomach ulcers. His team's research was initially rejected and unpublished. Barry did what any scientist would do. He took a solution containing the Helicobacter pylori bacteria, drank it, and waited to see what happened. 3 days later, he started developing symptoms of stomach ulcers. More research was published, his work was taken seriously, and he won a Nobel Prize in the early 2000s with his research partner. The moral of the story is, they say don't be resentful of others because it's like drinking poison and hoping the other people suffer. That's usually true, but sometimes it earns you a Nobel Prize and an immediate mention in every medical school textbook. Story 51. I vaguely recall a story from World War II that may or may not be apocryphal. There was an intersection where Allied forces would pass through to join up with other Allied forces. They posted a man there to guide passing troops where to go. However, the Germans set up an ambush to destroy those passing forces along another path in the intersection. The Germans then killed the postman, took his United States Army uniform, and began leading the United States soldiers in the wrong direction toward the ambush. When United States forces realized what was happening, they had an idea. They posted black guards at that location and ordered their troops to immediately open fire if they saw anyone standing there who was not black. Story 52. If you wrote a movie about the amateur poker player who won the 2003 World Series of Poker, the producers would beg you to call him anything but Chris Moneymaker. Story 53. The Siege of Osowiec Fortress in 1915, probably better known to Sabaton fans as the Attack of the Dead Men. The short version of the story, and the part that makes it so unbelievable, is that after a long siege of the fortress by about 8,000 German soldiers, there were roughly 100 Russian and Polish soldiers left holding Osowiec. The Germans then proceeded to flood the area with chlorine gas, which has the devastating effect of basically melting you from the inside out. The Russian and Polish soldiers, coughing up blood, bile, and bits of their own lungs and looking like zombies, launched one last counterattack against the advancing Germans, who were expecting everyone to be dead. The unexpected aggression and terrifying sight of the defenders actually managed to rout the 8,000 German soldiers and reclaim most of the defensive positions around Osowiec. In the end, it did not matter. The men who were gassed still died, and Osowiec was taken by the Germans fairly easily not long after. But what a story it is. Story 54. How the British stole tea from China. They sent an agent to discover how the Chinese were making tea and steal samples to grow in India. In 1848, the British East India Company sent Robert Fortune, a Scottish botanist, to buy samples of Chinese luxury varieties. Foreigners in China were not allowed outside the treaty ports. Fortune, a large Scotsman, disguised himself as a high-ranking Mandarin and traveled undercover despite not speaking much Chinese. Fortune shaved his head, plaited the hair at the back into the classic braid, and wore silk robes. When challenged about his strange accent and poor Chinese, he told questioners he was from northern China. He did this for years and made multiple trips. This should be the plot for a long-forgotten comedy from the 1970s, but it actually happened. He obtained the samples and exposed massive fraud in the Chinese tea industry, where some teas were treated with cyanide to make them look like more expensive versions to sell to foreigners. Story 55. Battle for Castle Itter. German and American soldiers, along with some 50 French prisoners, banded together to fight the SS in 1945. Also, the Attack of the Dead Men. During World War I, German soldiers gassed a Russian fortress to kill the defenders. However, around 100 soldiers survived and charged the approaching German army while literally coughing up bloody chunks of their lungs. The German army retreated in panic, believing they were attacked by zombies. Story 56. In 1896, promoters staged a train wreck for a large crowd of non-paying spectators. 2 engines, each pulling 7 boxcars, approached each other head-on at a combined speed of 120 miles per hour. 50,000 people watched as they collided. Unfortunately, one of the boilers burst, an event that all of the engineers agreed could not happen. In the explosion, 2 people were killed. The town of Crush, Texas, which had been created for this single event, grew from nothing to the second largest town in Texas, then back to nothing by midnight the next day. This was all to promote the railroad. Story 57. The former president of the United States and candidate was shot during a rally by a single man from a very obvious location, which an army of the best-prepared bodyguards in the world completely missed. He survived because the bullet barely touched his ear, despite the elite guards allowing him to stand up and wave his arms while the shooter was still active. Additionally, a bullet wound in the ear of an elderly man disappeared without leaving any scar. Story 58. In the early 1990s, 24-year-old yours truly was visiting Dallas on vacation from my teaching job in South Texas. Lying on my parents' bed, watching the period piece, I'll Fly Away, an NBC drama set in 1960s Alabama. There was a scene in which the police turned enormous hoses on African-American civil rights protesters marching for the right to vote, in addition to sicking dogs on the marchers. I complained about what I considered obvious exaggeration of just how racist things were, then saw the shocked look on my parents' faces as they realized their intelligent, college-educated daughter had no idea that really happened just a few years after my parents lived there. Story 59. People believe a story about a virus originating from a bat and allow their entire world to be controlled by dangerous individuals who transfer their wealth and force them to accept a cure worse than the original virus. Story 60. Most of Peter Wessel Tordenskiold's exploits during the Great Northern War. Drunkenly writing angry letters to taunt the enemy, repeatedly engaging much bigger and more heavily armed warships than his own and somehow winning once or thrice. Keeping a tame brown bear as a pet on board a warship and training it to sit still while he shot an apple off its head with his flintlock pistol. Alternately court-martialed and promoted, pulling off insane bluffs and acts of subterfuge that seem utterly ridiculous, like trying to dress up as Swedes by turning their coats inside out so the blue lining would be on the outside instead of the red Danish-Norwegian colors. Fighting until they ran out of gunpowder, then toasting the enemy and agreeing to meet again after both ships had resupplied, though the other side did not show. Racing to Copenhagen to be the first to inform the king about a victory, hoping for royal gratitude. Pure madness throughout his career. He died in an unfair duel over a piece of fake taxidermy, which he rightly pointed out as fake. The other man brought a heavy saber while he had his dress small sword. Tordenskiold was a gunman, not a fencer. Story 61. The story of Immo Koivunen. At one point, he skied right through a Soviet camp. Soviet soldiers looked in amazement as he passed through their camp and was gone before they could react. Story 62. Alexander the Great. You can create a biography of him once people know who he was. However, if you create a character that only focuses on his spree of conquering and his interactions with philosophers, it would be dismissed as an unbelievable idealized character who could never exist like that in the real world. Story 63. The British raid on the French dry dock during World War II. Most Victoria Crosses were awarded in any action. Innovations were created specifically for this mission. The plot is wilder than some of the military intelligence movies. Story 64. Recently, I think the Thailand tsunami was of such a scale that people find it hard to believe. Hamida Jandubi, Wikipedia. Tsutomu Yamaguchi. The man who survived 2 atomic bombings. The first time I heard about the USS Indianapolis was in the movie Jaws, when Quint tells the story of being there and surviving. I thought it was a made-up story for drama. The true story behind the USS Indianapolis monologue in Jaws. Story 65. Private Dan Daly. During the Boxer Rebellion, he and another Marine were sent to meet up with a working party to repair a hole in the defense. They were not there, so he volunteered to stay behind while the other Marine went to get them. While away, they heard machine gun fire. They knew it would take too long to get back to him before he was overrun. As they returned to where they left him, they passed by many dead bodies. Then they saw a red glow on the top of the hill. As they approached, they saw young Daly sitting down smoking a cigarette. They told him that they thought when the machine gun fire stopped, it was because he was killed. He said, "No, they just stopped coming," or something to that effect. The unbelievable part is that there were about 200 martial artists, all with traditional melee weapons. They kept coming wave after wave, believing they could dodge or deflect bullets. But they were all mowed down. Story 66. The Evacuation of Dunkirk. We sat down as a family to watch the Christopher Nolan movie. It was progressing and we were enjoying it until my wife started saying, "There's no way this would happen. It's totally unrealistic." My eldest daughter, who loves history, and I looked at her with surprised expressions. She insisted, "What, you're not believing this, are you? All those people just volunteering in those little boats. That would never happen. This movie is rubbish." My eldest said, "Oh my God, Mom." I said, this is a true story. This actually happened." She needed quite some convincing. Story 67. I would say the tournament held by Augustus the Strong to decide who was the best fox tosser. Augustus II the Strong, the King of Poland and Elector of Saxony, held a famous tossing contest in Dresden at which 647 foxes, 533 hares, 34 badgers, and 21 wildcats were tossed and killed. Could not make it up. He also allegedly had as many as 382 children. Legend. Story 68. A large number of the Holy Roman Empire's nobility died after falling into a basement or tank beneath rotten floorboards that was filled with human waste. It happened twice in the same place. The nobility drowned because the floor collapsed. Later generations decided to do the exact same thing in the same spot. The moral is to learn from history. Story 69. Basically, everything related to Donald Trump since he announced his first candidacy for president has been quite remarkable. If you had told me 15 years ago that he would become president while engaging in such controversial behavior, I would not have believed you. Story 70. Digby Tatum Warder disabled a German armored car by sticking his umbrella through the observational slit and poking the driver in the eye. Story 71. The story of the wreck of the Batavia and its survivors on the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands. In 1629, some of the islands were the scene of an infamous shipwreck and mutiny. The Dutch ship Batavia, under the command of Francisco Pelsaert, ran aground on her maiden voyage to the port of Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies. Pelsaert and some of his crew set off in an open boat to Batavia, now Jakarta, to get help. A group of the crew who remained on some of the islets terrorized and killed many of the other crew and passengers, including women and children. When Pelsaert returned, a number of the culprits were executed. After the ship had broken apart, approximately 300 of the Batavia's 341 passengers and crew made their way ashore, the rest drowning in their attempts. Her commander, Francisco Pelsaert, sailed to Batavia to get help, leaving in charge senior Dutch East India Company official Geronimus Cornelis. Unaware he had been plotting a mutiny prior to the wreck, Cornelis tricked about 20 men under soldier Wiebe Hayes into searching for fresh water on nearby islands, leaving them to die. With the help of other mutineers, he then orchestrated a massacre that, over the course of several weeks, resulted in the murder of approximately 125 of the remaining survivors, including women, children, and infants. A small number of women were kept as sex slaves. Meanwhile, Hayes' group unexpectedly found fresh water and, after learning of the atrocities, waged battles with Cornelis' group. In October 1629, at the height of their last and deadliest battle, they were interrupted by the return of Pelsaert aboard the rescue vessel Sardam. Pelsaert subsequently tried and convicted Cornelis and 6 of his men, who became the first Europeans to be legally executed in Australia. 2 other mutineers, convicted of comparatively minor crimes, were marooned on mainland Australia, thus becoming the first Europeans to permanently inhabit the Australian continent, although nothing more was heard of them. Only 122 of the original passengers made it to the port of Batavia. I would definitely recommend reading about the finer details. Utterly crazy stuff. Story 72. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand occurred after the first assassination attempt failed. One of the assassins went to get a sandwich after the initial attempt, and Ferdinand's driver took a wrong turn, causing the vehicle to stall. Gavrilo Princip, the assassin, then approached the stalled vehicle and shot the Archduke and his wife at point-blank range. Story 73. Stalin, leader of the largest communist nation, believed that Hitler, leader of a nation that invaded after promising not to and author of a book demonizing communism, would not invade him. Despite there having been many religions from across the world with unique systems and ideas, the three major religions are all based on the same sources and were founded relatively close to each other. Story 74, Mad Jack Churchill. A legendary life, including storming the beaches at Normandy with a sword and bow. Story 75, The Death of Henry Ziegland. Henry left his wife of 5 years, which caused her to commit suicide. Her brother decided to murder Henry, so he snuck up on him while he was working in the barn and shot at him. The bullet grazed Henry's cheek and embedded in a tree behind the barn. Henry lay down and pretended to be dead. His wife's brother, thinking he had accomplished his goal, then killed himself. 20 years go by, and Henry decides to chop down the tree in front of his barn because it is too big and in the way. Henry and his brother take turns chopping at the tree, but it is too hard and progress is slow. Henry decides to use 3 sticks of dynamite to take the tree down. He ties them around the tree and lights the fuse. The explosion sends the bullet that had embedded in the tree 20 years earlier straight into Henry's head, killing him. Story 76. Many scenes have already been cut from existing movies, mostly about World War II but also recently about World War I. Off the top of my head, Zhukov's uniform in Death of Stalin was redesigned to reduce the number of medals he actually wore. He had around 25 to 30 orders and medals, many in duplicates. I saw a World War I film where the director reduced the amount of electronics shown because it would disrupt people's suspension of disbelief. Story 77. The Ukrainian F-16 pilot killed a few days ago ran out of missiles while shutting down drones. He shot down an incoming missile with the machine gun, got hit by debris, steered the plane away from civilian areas, and was unable to eject. What a hero. This is like a dramatic scene from a movie, but it happened in real life. Story 78. The fact that Napoleon was once attacked by rabbits during a hunting trip is one of those moments that would definitely be cut from any serious film script. Who would believe it? Story 79. Practically the entirety of Oliver Cromwell's life after the start of the English Civil War. A man with very little military experience rises to power largely because he pays his troops on time and insists on sobriety and commitment to the cause. He fights battle after battle as he topples the English monarchy, outmaneuvers his political rivals, and ultimately establishes a military dictatorship after having the king executed. Once in power, he becomes increasingly ruthless, crushing his enemies across the British Isles and subjugating the Irish with notable severity. When he dies, he is buried much like a monarch. If I saw this movie, it would seem like something out of a fantasy. There would be many unbelievable things about it all. Story 81. The War of the Bucket. The Russian fleet's disastrous long journey to fight the Japanese at Tsushima. Mad Jack Churchill. The 90-year-old man who fought with the Red Army in World War II. The other Marco Polo who traveled the opposite direction. Story 81. Arthur John Priest was a fireman and stoker aboard several ships in the early 1900s. He survived a collision on the Royal Mail ship Asturias in 1908, a collision on the Royal Mail ship Olympic with His Majesty's ship Hawke in 1911, the sinking of the Royal Mail ship Titanic in 1912, the sinking of the His Majesty's Hospital ship Britannic in 1916, and the sinking of the steamship Donegal in 1917. He retired after the sinking of the steamship Donegal, saying that no one wanted to sail with him after all those disasters. Story 82. The Tulsa Massacre was tragic. Some individuals were literally flying planes over the black neighborhood, dropping explosives. It is difficult to understand such intense hatred. Story 83. I fully rejected Hacksaw Ridge as possibly being based on true events when I saw it. I just found it too unbelievable that an unarmed, non-combatant medic could spend so long on his own rescuing wounded soldiers in hostile territory. Story 84. Hulagu Khan's sacking of Baghdad was too shocking even by medieval standards. His army killed the entire population, numbering a few million, in a few days. The Tigris River ran black with the ink of the books they burned and pillaged. Story 85. This is only partially accurate because it has been portrayed in at least 3 films. The dive bomber attack that sank 3 Japanese aircraft carriers at Midway was the result of many chain events happening at the right moment. If the films were not based on historical fact, you would dismiss it as lazy scriptwriting. To add to this, the accuracy of ordnance on target, achieved at the perfect moment, was to the best of my knowledge never matched by a single squadron in any other combat situation during the Pacific War. It happened only at the time when it truly mattered. Story 86. Washington's Newburgh Address sounds like something from a bicentennial made-for-television movie. Luckily, it really happened. Story 87. The cavalry charged across a frozen river to capture Navy ships. This was the first and only time the cavalry had a naval engagement and won. Story 88. Oliver Cromwell would be quite extreme. Probably the start of World War I would be a bit far-fetched. I am constantly surprised that there are not more movies or television shows about Donald Trump. Even if they are only based on court transcripts, the crimes are insane and broad in scope. Story 89. At the start of World War I, a single German soldier captured Fort Douaumont. The fort had been heavily shelled, and the defenders had all gone to the basement to wait out the bombardment. Then a single German soldier walked in and took them all prisoner. Story 90. Celestial phenomenon over Nuremberg, April 14, 1561. Here is the artist's account who painted a picture of the event. In the morning of April 14, 1561, at daybreak, between 4 and 5 a.m., a dreadful apparition appeared on the sun. It was seen in Nuremberg in the city, before the gates, and in the countryside by many men and women. First, in the middle of the sun, two blood-red semicircular arcs appeared, resembling the moon in its last quarter. In the sun, above, below, and on both sides the color was blood-red. There stood a round ball of partly dull, partly black ferrous color. Likewise, on both sides and as a torus around the sun, there were many such blood-red objects and other balls in large numbers, about 3 in a line and 4 in a square, and some alone. Between these globes, a few blood-red crosses were visible. Between these crosses were blood-red strips, becoming thicker to the rear and in front malleable like rods of reed grass, which were intermingled. Among them were 2 big rods, one on the right and the other on the left. Within the small and big rods were 3, 4, or more globes. These all started to move as if fighting among themselves. The globes initially in the sun flew out to those standing on both sides. Then the globes standing outside the sun, in the small and large rods, flew back into the sun. Besides this, the globes flew back and forth, fighting vehemently with each other for over an hour. When the conflict in and out of the sun was most intense, they became fatigued to such an extent that they all fell from the sun to the earth as if they were burning, then wasted away on the earth with immense smoke. After this, something like a black spear, very long and thick, was sighted. The shaft pointed east, and the point pointed west. Whatever such signs mean, God alone knows. Although we have seen, shortly one after another, many kinds of signs in the heavens sent by the Almighty God to bring us to repentance, we still are unfortunately so ungrateful that we despise such high signs and miracles of God. We speak of them with ridicule and discard them to the wind, so that God may send us a frightening punishment for our ungratefulness. The God-fearing will by no means discard these signs, but will take them to heart as a warning from their merciful Father in heaven. They will mend their lives and faithfully beg God to avert his wrath, including well-deserved punishment, so that we may temporarily hear and perpetually there live as his children. May God grant us his help. Amen. By Hans Glaser, letter painter of Nuremberg. Story 91. I think Hacksaw Ridge was toned down because the actual person was too intense, and the people who were pitched the idea or the test audience found it too unbelievable. Story 92. The Magenta Crash from 1933. We all know the realistic explanation is that either someone invented a carbon aging machine, or that someone perfectly preserved 90-year-old ink, paper, and a telegram printer in some basement and decided to fake Mussolini's telegrams. Story 93. If you described the September 11th attacks before they happened, most people would ask, which Harrison Ford movie is that? Story 94. I listened to an interview with an author who wrote about the Iranian embassy hostage situation in the 1970s. It should have come with Benny Hill theme music. Story 95. The Battle of Dio, including its setup and outcome, would be dismissed as a trite power fantasy. Story 96. I haven't seen it posted yet, but this is pretty much the life of Thomas Cochrane. You can pick any of his battles and look at it with disbelief. Probably the main one is his Battle of the El Gamo. His small 14-gun brig captured a 32-gun frigate with 6 times as many men and 12 times the size of the guns. His tactic was to be so small they couldn't hit him, then board and take down the flag to convince the enemy they had surrendered. His entire life was so remarkable that 2 different novel series were based on it, Hornblower and Master and Commander. Both authors had to tone down the exploits, and the movie didn't even cover his most impressive actions. Story 97. Kudalin, a descendant of Genghis Khan, refused to marry unless her suitor could beat her in a wrestling match. Nobody ever defeated her. Story 98. When Apollo 13 was released, one journalist criticized it for being entirely unrealistic American propaganda. No one believed anyone would survive. Story 99. Napoleon's 100 Days refers to the period when he left his exile on Elba, returned to France, and became emperor again. Sounds like pure fiction. Story 100. Battle of Castle Eder. United States Army, German Army, armed French prisoners of war, and Austrian resistance fighters all fought together against the Schutzstaffel 3 days after the German surrender in World War II. Story 101. Edward Ivy's reign. He deposed the king and became king himself, married a commoner, was deposed twice, and his sons were betrayed by his loyal brother. Story 102. The murder of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters 2 days after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Story 103. John Joseph Merlin was a Georgian instrument maker and designer of automata, which are clockwork robots. He was known as an eccentric who appeared at high society functions with strange clockwork devices, such as a chair he could drive around the room. On one occasion, he attended a party dressed as a barmaid and played a violin he made while on roller skates, which he invented, before crashing into and destroying the host's very expensive mirror. His last known public appearance was riding through Hyde Park in a horseless horse-drawn carriage propelled by a windlass, a type of engine powered by a hand crank. Story 104. The Great Emu War. In 1932, the Great Emu War was a real, though unusual, military operation in Australia. It involved the Australian military attempting to cull emus, large flightless birds that were damaging crops in the Campion district of Western Australia. Despite the use of machine guns, the emus proved surprisingly resilient, and the campaign was ultimately deemed a failure. Story 105. If Hollywood were to make a film out of Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, however unlikely that it ever would or even could be made, most of the story would be, there is no way that happened. It did? I remember someone presented me with All Quiet on the Western Front and Storm of Steel and described one as an autobiographical work of fiction and one as just an edited war diary, and asked me to guess which was which. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.